Spider-Man becomes the King in Black and then kills the Marvel Universe. Venom War is amazing. So before we get into that, there is something that I want to cover first, and that is the second part of Venomous, which is the team up between Black Widow and Anti-Venom. The reason why this is important is because this is going to give us a way out of this story, which is cool. Because one of the things that we saw was that the zombiotes were basically just symbiotes that were effectively mindless, bonded to dead bodies, right? To corpses, cadavers. And literally, they were just like Marvel zombies with symbiotes in Venom War. And it was cool. Now, the thing about this is that this technically takes place before the main zombiote story, but Marvel's not releasing the comics in reading order. They're releasing them whenever it is that writers get it done, which is one of the biggest issues Marvel has and has always had when it comes to crossover events. Also, the green guy in the shirt is wearing Crocs. We just need to say that. So one of the things that happens in this story is that Anti-Venom realizes he can cure the zombiotes of the zombies themselves. Now, the reason why this works, and of course, most of you guys who are familiar with Agent Venom already know this, is that as Anti-Venom, he's quite literally the antithesis to symbiotes, right? He's like one of the only people out there that can defeat God, Carnage, things like that. But he literally destroys or annihilates symbiote matter. And that's what's going on here. That in effect, Anti-Venom, his fists, basically are the cure for whatever ails these people. Sounds like a line from Wolverine in Marvel Comics. But he literally starts punching the symbiotes off of these guys. Now, for some of them, they're already dead. For others, it actually turns out they were alive. Because as we know, when the zombiotes started to escape, they started bonding themselves indiscriminately to people. So basically turning living people into zombiotes. Now, he's not the only one that figures this out. Liz Allen, who's a character that's basically the head of Alchemax, that's kind of corrupt organization, but really the ones that engineered the zombiotes in the first place, she also has an Anti-Venom based symbiote. So much like Anti-Venom himself, she can cure people. Now, it's not overly important that you understand who Liz Allen is, at least not to the greater story as a whole. Some people will say that you need to know who she is. That's not true. What is important here, though, is that she's the other half of this coin. So in effect, you've got two people now that can cure people. And so as Liz starts to figure this out, of course, she's out there in the streets dealing with all these zombie symbiotes, while you have Anti-Venom and Black Widow who were dealing with the zombie symbiotes within the facility. Now, of course, Flash Thompson being Anti-Venom, not the sharpest tool in the shed, as cool as he is. So while they're making their way up an elevator shaft, one of the things he does is he continues punching people, and some of them start falling down the shaft. And the thing about this is, because they're all zombie symbiotes, you don't know who's actually alive or dead under the symbiote itself until you knock the symbiote off of them. And so for a couple of these folks, they were actually living. Now, of course, it's due to the quick thinking of Black Widow that they're essentially saved. But the fact remains that once they get back up out of the elevator shaft, these zombiotes have already escaped. And one of the cool things about them is that because they are part symbiote, they have all the capabilities that a symbiote normally has, namely super strength, the ability to dodge Spider-Man's spider sense, as well as the ability to use their symbiote matter to swing around. And so what goes on here is that because the group meets up with Liz Allen, and they end up realizing on a viewfinder is the main conflict with Venom War itself, which is Eddie Brock as Venom alongside Spider-Man with the Venom symbiote, as well as Eddie's son Dylan. Anti-Venom takes off to deal with that. And so what that means is that the Venomous book shifts away from being a Black Widow and Flash Thompson book, and it becomes a Black Widow Liz Allen comic, which I'm not overly against. I'm actually kind of curious to see where things go. Now, there is also the second issue of the Zombiotes comic. It was really cool with the first issue because basically it just dealt with like the Zombiotes running around the city outside of what we were just talking about a second ago. The problem with the second issue is that it largely focuses on She-Hulk, and so the comic just really isn't all that great. And so this is when you switch over to the main Venom War story itself, specifically focusing on Carnage and Meridius. Now remember, Meridius is the most powerful of all the symbiotes who are here outside of Carnage. The Carnage, as we mentioned before, has basically attained godhood, and there's a reason why he's called Symbiote Satan, because he has all the strengths of symbiotes with none of their weaknesses. At the moment, the campaign of Meridius and Carnage is basically aligned here because they both want to see Eddie Brock, the current King in Black, destroyed. One, because it would allow Carnage to basically basically kill him and take his place as the King in Black. And of course, Meridius would ultimately stand against it, but Meridius doesn't realize how powerful Carnage is. And so most likely when the conflict comes down to the two of them, that Carnage would destroy Meridius. But for the moment, Meridius is just kind of watching everything unfold and just sort of waiting to see how the dust settles. Because remember, as the most powerful symbiote here, he controls seemingly all the other symbiotes. And yes, he is a version of Eddie Brock from the future, but that'll be a little confusing given how deep we are in the story. But with all these zombiotes running around and converting normal humans into zombie symbiotes, they would all fall under the control of Meridius so long as Eddie Brock can be dealt with and effectively eliminated. But one of the things that Carnage tells Meridius is that he's operating in a vacuum, that he's not looking at the bigger picture. Because what he says here is he says, the zombiote strain already spreads like a disease, with a single bite propagating within each new host, living or dead. Corpses become crawlers, shambling mindful remnants. But living victims are even more dangerous. They retain all their original speed, all their strength, and any special powers. And these swingers can draw on the symbiote's innate abilities as well. And so the contagion spreads, generating new symbiote matter under my control. Eventually, I'll have enough to rebuild the garden that you destroyed in the future, but thanks to Venom, it'll be new and improved, a Venom world. And in the future I'm building, it'll be all mine, not my idiot son's. So when you showed Eddie that vision, I'm afraid you only helped me, Carnage. I hope there are no hard feelings. I'd hate for us to fall out now. And so what Carnage says here is he says, I know a winner when I see one, and I'm happy to watch you work, but have you really thought of everything? And where Meridius asks the question, right? Like, is this where you show your true colors, right? Are you really going to try to kill me? That kind of a thing. You know, the pig sticker, as he calls it, that Carnage corrects him, right? He's like, it's the all blood, the necro spear. And you of all people know how powerful this weapon can be. And so he tells him, like, I wanted to give you a friendly warning. He says, no matter how much you may have rigged the game, there's always a wild card. The one person that Meridius seemingly didn't count on here was Flash Thompson Anti-Venom, that an Anti-Venom can basically cure normal people. Now, a lot of this is really hitting at the idea that Meridius is getting carried away with himself, right? That he doesn't realize how powerful Anti-Venom is relative to his own abilities, right? The best offense is a good defense. And so, of course, this leads to Flash Thompson continuing on his path to basically catch up with Spider-Man and Eddie and all those guys. And then you pick up with like the main conflict itself, right? Dylan Brock, who's wearing Sleeper and Flexo, I'll talk about what that means here in a second, along with the Bedlam symbiote, which is basically Eddie Brock when he's just full of rage, right? Just nothing more than pissed off. And then, of course, Spider-Man with the Venom symbiote itself. Now, one of the things that happens here with Dylan is that when you have Flexo and you have Sleeper, these are both symbiotes. That one of the things to keep in mind about Dylan Brock is that he can control symbiotes, right? He's not as powerful as Meridius, but he can control them nonetheless. Now, of course, Sleeper is just any symbiote out there with its own varying degrees of abilities, but Flexo is one that we haven't talked about. Flexo was a symbiote that arrived on Earth eons ago, and it's more or less been manipulated or used or different things like that by various groups out there. The reason why it's called Flexo is because of the fact that it actually takes on a form that makes it look like a robot. It was kind of goaded into doing that, but it's why it looks so different in comparison to other symbiotes that are there. But one of the things that we saw over the main Venom story was that Dr. Doom, who was time displaced, had come into contact with Flexo in the distant past. I'll talk about why that matters here in a second. But one of the things that goes on is that Bedlam tries to destroy Dylan. Now, of course, Eddie Brock himself shows up here and then basically incapacitates Bedlam, and that's essentially it. For those of you guys who are a little confused by all these different people being called Eddie Brock, is a little bit of a refresher here. Bedlam, Tyro, these different symbiotes, they're all just Eddie Brock over the varying stages of grief, right? So like you find out that you die and you're 8 kinds of pissed off. That's what Bedlam represents, right? That version of Eddie, except, you know, Eddie can talk to himself. I know it's weird and it's wonky, but the fact is, it is cool. And so one of the things that happens is that in the middle of this entire conflict, when Eddie starts talking to Dylan and says, okay, cool, relax, son, everything's sorted. Let's get rid of the symbiotes and let's just talk. The Flexo starts to make a move against him. And what you do is you go back to this point when Dr. Doom had encountered Flexo. And what Dr. Doom had done is he had instilled a kind of mental program in Flexo that said that what you are going to do is you're going to watch and you're going to wait. At some point, Eddie Brock will become the new King in Black. When he does, all symbiotes will fall under his control. When the time is right, you will be the hand of my vengeance against him, and his own son will be your weapon. In essence, Flexo follows the instruction of Doom, and this moment, being the one that he was waiting for, starts operating against the will of Dylan and blasts Eddie Brock. Now, of course, as we know, Eddie as a King in Black can reconstitute himself from pretty much anything, right? It's impossible to kill Eddie in this current form, and Dr. Doom knows that. And so, having been time displaced from the present into the past, he tells Flexo, I will teach you a variation of the ovoid mind exchange process that dislocates an opponent's psyche so that Doom's can replace it. At the proper moment, when Brock is no longer reinforced by a symbiote, this will shift his soul out of alignment with his physical form. Once you've disrupted his control over his physical body, damage him faster than he can heal. Convey my vengeance and yours. Destroy Eddie Brock by his son's own hand. What this would really mean here and what's actually going on is that with Eddie Brock's soul, quote unquote, being displaced from his own body, his body is basically just a shell. And so what that would do is allow Dr. Doom to place his soul into the body of Eddie Brock, seize his position as the King in Black, and then become like this new authoritarian power across the universe. Why would he do this? Because it's Dr. Doom. Now, the whole time this is happening, you've also got Normie Osborn, who has the Red Goblin symbiote, basically a variation of Carnage. And that what Normie does is he starts saying Kang, just repeatedly, right? Kang, just over and over and over again. And while Spider-Man is watching all of this, Bedlam recovers just quick enough to attack Spider-Man, incapacitate him momentarily, and then Kang appears to Normie. And he says, history does not remember you fondly, Normie, and I am history, I am Kang. And because Kang is overly complicated and overly complex for some strange reason, the only thing to really know here is that he put a kind of mental trigger in the Normie Red Goblin symbiote, so that when Normie got it, this symbiote would trigger this memory at this point in time. Think of it as kind of like a memory bomb that was activated after the countdown was over. And what he says is, I know that Dr. Doom is going to try to infiltrate your symbiote hive somehow, but his revenge does not align with my conquest. So when he makes his move, disrupt him. Take his pawn off the board with extreme prejudice. And so what this segment does here, as confusing as it may be, is it establishes a proxy war between Dr. Doom and Kang the Conqueror. Why? Because each one of these guys is trying to seize control of Eddie by way of any of these symbiotes and then attain the position of being the new King in Black. So in the midst of this war, their proxy war is basically just a conflict over there. And so with Normie Osborn and Flexo fighting one another, that continues on in the Fantastic Four one-shot, which has not come out yet. It actually comes out at the end of the month. Again, Marvel doesn't release these comics in the reading order, they release it in just the release order because they like making life hard on us as comic book readers. And so initially what happens is Spider-Man gets the upper hand on Bedlam enough to incapacitate him, and then the symbiote starts talking to Spider-Man and it says, look over there, right? Like Eddie Brock's in shambles, he can't heal himself, his son Dylan is over there, and Venom talks about how he had basically left Dylan because he didn't believe that him being a part of Dylan's life was beneficial. Why? Well, because everybody was trying to attain the Venom symbiote, and they were willing to kill Dylan to get it. So in order to keep Dylan safe, he walked away from Dylan, right? The very nature of Venom invites chaos and danger. And so what happens is Spider-Man is forced to make a choice, and he fires the Venom symbiote off of himself and onto Eddie, which basically restores both Dylan and Eddie and allows Dylan to become his almost alter ego with probably one of the coolest outfits ever, and then allows Eddie Brock to go back to being traditional Venom. But here's the kicker to all of this, right? We saw most everything else as it was transpiring from everybody else's perspective. What we do here is we switch over to Spider-Man's perspective, looking at all of this. And one of the things that happens is that in the midst of the fight that he had with Bedlam, suddenly Spider-Man's mind is yanked away from his physical body. So yes, his body's fighting, but he's almost fighting on autopilot, right? What his mind ends up doing is coming into contact with the the eventuality. Now, as a kind of a refresher here, for those of you guys that may need one, because again, I'm throwing a lot of stuff at you, when Eddie Brock became the King in Black, and then Eddie Brock basically died, that's when he encountered Meridius and Bedlam and all those different versions of himself over the course of the dying process, right? Meridius is just another stage, right? Eddie will become Tyro, then he'll become Bedlam, and so on and so forth. But what Meridius does not want to do is become or join the eventuality. The eventuality is effectively the afterlife for all Kings in Black across the multiverse, right? Because Meridius is trying to escape that, Meridius has set all of this stuff in motion. But this is the first time that we actually see the eventuality for what it truly is. Because in every instance of us seeing the eventuality up to this point, it just came in the form of a hand. Now, why it chose the hand, we don't necessarily know. Arguably, it's the hand that creates. But again, we don't really have a definitive answer. But what the eventuality does is it basically pulls Peter out of all space and time, and then it throws him into one potential future where he becomes the King in Black, which is to say, what would have happened if he had held on to the Venom Symbiote in this particular conflict? That most likely what would have happened is that Eddie Brock and all these guys would have been destroyed. We don't really get the full details on this outside of the fact that in the here and now, at least this potential future, Spider-Man's killed everybody. He's wiped out pretty much all the superheroes and arguably all the cosmic entities that are out there. Now we know that because he says, from world to world, my web stretches through the void. I give form to infinity and sit at the center of the stars. I am the king of all that remains in this empty webbed universe. And I've come a long way from queens. The few who remain beyond my control now marshal against me. I can sense it. Every one of them wants a friend. Even now, they are so very brave. I wish it hadn't come to this. It's the kind of thing I've heard tyrants say across centuries. But now, in this terrible moment, I mean it genuinely. I've been fighting for so long. Villains, heroes, armadas, empires, ever since that day in New York. My so-called victory, Mary Jane's mastery of the Arachneote symbiote, our rule as king and queen, until she was consumed, until our daughter chose the darkness of Groot space over feeling her grief. They'll never understand why I protect them, what I lost all those years ago with a single choice. Instead, they rage against the dying of their chaotic galaxy. I have to remind myself in this moment more than any other, this is my fault. And what we end up finding out is that the marshaling of these forces comes by way of the Guardians of the Galaxy, a ragtag band of superheroes, combined with what looks like Stark tech, alongside Hulkling, who's a shapeshifter, but also immensely powerful and is currently taken on the form of the Hulk, as well as the Silver Surfer and Arachneote. Now, one of the things to know is that despite the fact that this is the Guardians of the Galaxy and they are traditional superheroes and Spider-Man is usually a superhero to them, that what they end up doing is approaching this with the idea that like Spider-Man has to die. But one of the coolest things about this is it shows just how capable Spider-Man really is and why Spider-Man is able to survive most circumstances when he shouldn't, right? Because what happens is Star-Lord is like, one last ride, Guardians, and Rocket Raccoon's like, speak for yourself, I'm still planning on living forever, and kind of a little bit of banter back and forth. But we're also told we get one chance at this, so we hit him hard. His spider sense will have told him we're coming. So all we can do is forget the man he was and show no mercy. And the Silver Surfer even says he's defaced the spaceways beyond recognition. There is no longer mercy to offer. And so they just go full on into the assault. And they do everything they can, but it doesn't make any difference. Because between Spider-Man's spider sense as well as his capabilities as a King in Black, harnessing the power of the symbiotes, they all die like that. I mean, it's not even any contest at all. And that's one of the reasons why Spider-Man is so incredibly powerful. It's his spider sense, right? If you were to take Spider-Man's spider sense away, anybody could kill him under virtually any circumstance. Shoot him with a sniper rifle from a rooftop, it doesn't really matter. But because of his spider sense, even if he doesn't exactly know what danger is approaching and doesn't know exactly how to counter, he does know something's happening. And so he needs to move or bob or weave or dodge or whatever the case happens to be. be, right? Movement is life. And so what Spider-Man does is with his spider sense, he takes them all out so fast. It's kind of incredible to see. And so finally, he comes to Arachne and he asks, he says, was this what you wanted, Arachne? You weren't satisfied consuming my wife and my friends. You had to consume their futures as well. And that's where Arachne asks, like, what futures are you talking about? You never trusted anyone after you lost Mary Jane. You blamed yourself. You blamed us. You blamed your daughter. And where Peter initially kind of lashes out, right? He says, don't dare talk about my daughter, that sort of thing. That what Arachne says is you didn't lose her, you just couldn't see. And Peter, kind of overcome by grief and anger, doesn't really listen to anything Arachne is saying. Instead, he says, I see the entirety of time. I see through every symbiote in every moment. Everything I've done was for my family, but they're gone. And that's where Arachne says every symbiote except us. And that's when you realize Arachne is his daughter, that they were never actually gone from Peter, they simply weren't his. And that for reasons that again haven't been overly explained here, but we can largely surmise what they were. After the death of Mary Jane Watson, Peter Parker basically used his powers as the King in Black to quote unquote bring order to the universe itself, and seeing that the death of Mary Jane Watson represented chaos, it represented pandemonium, that sort of thing, that because there were people he couldn't save, he tried to exercise control. And that's why he made the universe what it was, this place of total control, which is normal, right? Breakups, death of a loved one, we feel this incredible sense of powerlessness when circumstances are thrust onto us beyond our control. And so in the face of the fact that in essence, his wife and his daughter didn't want to be a part of this empire, quote unquote, that he was creating, they walked away, right? They left. Now, really, it was more his daughter. Again, Mary Jane Watson seemingly died here, but it was more that Peter became the bad guy and they didn't want to join his side. So he eradicated anybody who didn't do things his way. And so that's why he starts hearing the voice of the Venom symbiote that says, Peter, can you hear my voice? Come back to me. You are lost in time, but time is a liar. Listen to the voice of the now. It's as you told me. And Peter kind of continues the statement in saying, we all have a choice. And as long as that's true, and the symbiote finishes in saying, nothing is eventual, right? So our ability to make conscious choices on our lives is what prevents guaranteed futures. Peter can get rid of the symbiote now, and he will not become the King in Black, which I think is interesting because there are a lot of fan theories out there that argue that Peter is supposed to be the King in Black. But this is kind of the answer to the question, what would happen if he was? And so Peter says, time to choose. And that's when he casts the symbiote off. He gives it back to Dylan and he gives it back to Eddie, and the two of them pop back up. And so at that point, it's time to get back into the conflict, to seize control of all these symbiotes that are out there, to face Meridius head on, and to bring an end to the conflict. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.